Good morning, PASW staff, clients, and friends. And hey now, welcome to Tuesday's class. Yesterday we looked at the right stuff and your film scoring assignment, which you'll get to me by tomorrow. And we'll see the results for Friday. That'll be very fun. Today we're going to be taking it real easy and talking about a composer, conductor, arranger who's contributed so much music, and somebody that you'll probably know, and somebody I love. We're going to be talking about the great musician Henry Mancini. Henry Mancini was important for so many things. Most importantly for blending jazz and rock and roll elements, and blending them in for the screen, for television and for film. So it wasn't just classical music he was doing, it wasn't just jazz music, and it wasn't rock music. He was taking all of those things and saying, how can we make this great for television shows and for movies? How can I take all these elements and make the music just as important as what you're seeing, not overshadowing it, but creating it where it's so good where it stands on its own. And he sold several soundtracks, where it was, because many times when we see movies that we really like, we want to get the soundtrack too, Before then, the soundtrack wasn't really something that a lot of the music that was background music was used effectively, but not something you would be, I can't wait to get the soundtrack. It worked for a good purpose. Henry Mancini is very important with, I'm going to make great music, it's going to be great content, but it's also going to stand on its own as a great soundtrack. So we're going to get into his life. We're going to talk about his training, his upbringing, and just kind of share some of his the most famous things that he's contributed to 20th century music. So we'll have a lot of fun. Henry Mancini is born in 1924, and the biggest thing that happens in 1924 is a composition that we've talked about a little bit, Rhapsody in Blue. So this is premiered. This premieres in 1924 by George Gershwin, and I'm bringing that up because Rhapsody in Blue is one of the first real jazz classical pieces that's performed at a concert hall originally. It's performed with the Bowl every year now, but it's a great blend of classical and jazz being put together. So Henry Mancini's born in this year, and he's born in Little Italy in Ohio, and raised in Pittsburgh for the most part, and his parents are Italian immigrants, and he starts playing the flute. His dad introduces him and teaches him music at a young age. But he really took to liking the piano, and he was very interested in arranging and orchestrating. So we know what that is. There's one thing writing a song on a piano. Now, how do you translate that to a band, to an orchestra? Henry Mancini was really great at knowing how to do that. So he studies piano and composition and orchestration at Carnegie Mellon. It's now Carnegie Mellon today in Pittsburgh. Van Dyke Parks also went to Carnegie Mellon, and as well as many famous musicians. Very great school. Then he goes to Juilliard, and we've talked about Juilliard. Almost every huge composer goes to Juilliard and studies music, still thriving today. And he studies composition and piano there at Juilliard. Then he goes into the Army, and he meets Glenn Miller. And he, at this time, the biggest music is big band music. That's what's really going on in the 40s. People like Glenn Miller that we've talked about, and Tommy Dorsey and Benny Goodman. These guys, these are the hit artists right now, and with the radio, because television's not in right now. After his musical training, and after getting out of the Army, he comes to LA and starts working at the Universal, their music department at Universal. And during the next 6 years, contributes to over 100 movies. He's writing and orchestrating all of the time, including the 1958 Orson Welles film Touch of Evil, which we looked at if you remember that opening scene of Touch of Evil, we looked at the beauty of the master shot. That was the class that we did months ago, where there's no cuts in the first, several minutes of it. He contributed source music to that. Now, source music is interesting because that's music that's heard when the characters are hearing it on the screen. Okay, it's not necessarily a soundtrack. It's if the character's listening to the radio in his house, that radio is source music, and that music was written by Henry Mancini. So that was a cool little effect that he was doing. But Mancini in the early 60s hooks up with Blake Edwards, and he's they have a huge collaboration. He gets Mancini and hires him for this new series he's developing, Peter Gunn. So you can hear there's elements of rock and roll. You can hear Mancini being smart, staying with the times of, okay, there's influx of the Beatles. The Beatles are almost on the scene, but the 50s is all, after the big band era, the 50s is all going to be rock and roll and Elvis. So in the 60s, he's like, well, how do we make film and television music relevant for the kids, quote unquote, because that's who buys music for the most part. So he's using just in the Peter Gunn theme elements of rock and roll, but still arranging it where an orchestra or a band, where they're performing it with this, big sound. And of course he goes on with Blake Edwards to do the very famous Breakfast at Tiffany's. Here's when he writes the song Moon River, which is one of the most famous songs ever written. And he wrote it in half an hour.
Off to see the world. There's such a lot of world to see. We're after the same rainbows and waiting round the bend. Very friend, Moon River, and me.
While collaborating with Blake Edwards, they go on and they do the Pink Panther series, which of course we know today is one of the most famous, iconic series ever created. Here we hear the elements of jazz big time, right? With the saxophone, and it's, part of it, sometimes it's lounge type music. It's hard to put your finger on it, right? I mean, it's classical, it's orchestrated in a classical way, perhaps, where there's not improvisation going on. All the musicians are reading music. They're not making stuff up. Instruments are kind of jazz-like with the saxophone. He's just making really kind of wonderful sounding music where if you didn't, if you don't know the Pink Panther, you still like the song a lot and you like the mood that it evokes because it's just cool. So, I mean, he turns out so much music for film and television. We just highlighted kind of some of the most famous because, it's so impressive, the amount of output. He died when he was 70, so pretty young. He died in 94. And I think what I personally love about Henry Mancini are his string arrangements. Now, I'm a sucker for that Hollywood sound, the sound of strings, and it's so beautiful. In particular, I mean, if we just look at Lujan. It's just, I mean, it's like you want to, it's just so dreamy, and you just want to fall into, I don't know, silk sheets or something, and just roll around, or so. I mean, it's just so ethereal. I love Lujan, and I love the strings in Breakfast at Tiffany's. I mean, just these lush strings, right? I mean, it's just so lush and dreamlike. It's such a, to me, that's my favorite. And those are his orchestrations. Those are his compositions. He really created a unique Hollywood sound in the 60s, mostly. I mean, and if we look at a timeline, just so we get it, this is when he's working. He's working mostly in the 60s and 70s, but before John Williams. So this is what film and television music sounds like pre-John Williams, because mostly when John Williams comes on the scene with Jaws in 75, he changes film music and elevates it in a way that's more classical sounding, right? Because we've talked about how John Williams uses the orchestra in a big classical way that goes back to Wagner and other composers. And Mancini doesn't sound anything like that. His is very easy listening music that the older adults in the 60s, the parents, they like a lot. And even the kids are kind of into it because the Pink Panther's hip and all these things are. So he had that great middle ground that was just so commercial yet very musical and singable and lovely. So that's a Henry Mancini, little taste of Henry Mancini. Great composer, supposedly a super sweet guy. And it was funny because I was reading that John Williams was the pianist on the original Peter Gunn sessions in 1958. So so it's composers working together, and little did he know he'd probably, go on to be one of the most famous film composers. So, but seems like a very sweet guy. Okay, good. I will see you tomorrow. Have a great rest of the day.